So thanks everyone for being here. Super excited to share a little bit about my knowledge of Google Analytics with you. So for today, my plan is really to spend the entirety of my session inside GA4, kind of showing you different tips and tricks that I've picked up that I think are really important to understand as you try and adopt GA4 more for yourself or your organization. So what we're going to do is first, we'll just cover some of the recent announcements and news of our industry and kind of unpack what that means. And then we're going to, again, plan the time to spend inside GA4, and we'll have time at the end to answer any live questions. So if you have those, as we go through, please put them in chat, and we'll make sure to leave time at the end for those. So if you've never had the chance to meet me before, my name's Charles. I work for AdSwerve, one of Google's kind of leading Google Analytics 360 and Google Marketing Platform partners. I've been working with Google Analytics for over 10 years, have very deep expertise in both the old version as well as this new version. And with that, in my spare time, I now have a 2-year-old. And outside of that, I play a lot of hockey, which is a new hobby that I picked up. I think 4 years ago. I started during COVID. And this is my team here. We're the dumpster fire, which I think is a good description of how we play. So with that, my plan for today is to kind of take you through a few things. And I think this is really important because there has been some new news and will continue to be news around GA4. You may have heard Google's delayed the deprecation timeline for their enterprise or 360 customers till July of 2024. But for many of you who are using the free version of Google Analytics, the deprecation of the old version is still occurring July of next year. So that's coming up very quick. And I think what's most important about that is to date, from my experience, a lot of people are still primarily using or falling back on the older version of Google Analytics. And as other presenters have shared, it's just really important to start embracing that that's no longer going to be an option. So I think my talk is going to be really relevant because what this means for the majority of our industry that's relied on Google Analytics is simply we all really have to start using it and become comfortable with it. So my plan for my talk today is to kind of start talking through some of the more advanced components in GA4. And in doing that, I really want to help you kind of avoid a lot of maybe the confusion or uncertainty and really just provide you more confidence with starting to understand how some of the things in GA4 really work. And related to that, I think you're going to leave this session with a few tips or tricks or things in the back of your mind that you're going to take back and make sure that you check or address as you're starting to really lean into GA4 more heavily. So depending on how I do with time, I'm hoping to take us through kind of these topics. We're going to talk about user identity. We'll talk about the Google Optimize integration. I'll spend a fair bit of time on attribution, which I actually think is one of the more confusing topics within GA4. And I'll explain why that is and hopefully provide some clarity on that. And then we'll spend a fair bit of time just talking about how we pull reports, some of the settings, and how essentially some things in GA4 might not necessarily work the way you might have thought at kind of first glance. So with that, I want to take us inside GA4, and we're going to start exploring really some of the kind of key fundamental concepts of GA4. And I don't think there's anything more fundamental than user identity. So how does Google Analytics 4 identify users? And related to that, basically, what can we do to track users with the different methods that we might have? So one of the things that you may or may not know is that for the first time, Google Analytics in this new version of GA4 actually has a setting inside the admin where you can change what identifier you want to use to track users. So here we're looking at a user's metric, and we can actually change how we want these users to be counted by going into the admin section. And inside the admin section, there's a setting called reporting identity. And in this reporting identity, there's 3 primary ways that GA4 can identify users. We have blended, observed, and device-based. And I'll explain what this really means. Now, one thing that I really like about GA4 is that this setting in here is actually flexible. And what I mean is previously in Google Analytics, many settings, when we would change them, they would be permanent. They'd actually permanently change the data that would come in from that point forward. But many settings in GA4 have been built to be flexible and retroactive. So if you want to change the user identity in GA4, you can change this and you can come back and change it later, and everything kind of applies on the fly. So it's not permanently changing any of your data, again, which I really like. So what are these three methods? Well, essentially, if we start expanding these, there's a lot of descriptors, but the most simple one is device-based. So device-based is primarily using the first-party cookie. So when anyone visits your website or has a mobile app, it creates an ID. It stores that ID until the user clears it. And that's kind of the default way most marketing solutions work, is with those kind of first-party cookies. And that's how Google Analytics has always worked. And that's what we call device-based. Now, there's these other settings called observed and blended. And here, what's important to note is if we look at the blended option, now with these, it's actually using or trying to use multiple IDs. So in here, it uses them in this order. So if you're a website that has your own user IDs, first and foremost, it'll use your own user IDs. And those are primarily where users log in to your website. Or maybe if you're sending email marketing, you can have a user ID of all those users that you append anytime they click on a URL. So simply, if you have user IDs, this will use that first and foremost. And this is a big improvement in GA4, because in the old version, when you tried to use your own user IDs, Google actually forced you to this entirely different profile, where in GA4, you can now change all the data directly in the views you're working on, which I think makes it a lot more accessible. Now, for this advanced topic, this is the real one that I want to focus on, is on this Google Signals. So Google Signals is Google's essentially cross-device graph of signed in Google users. So we're talking YouTube, we're talking Chrome. And if you enable Google Signals for your property, other users who visit your site who have also enabled advertising preferences will essentially be able to use Google's identity graph to allow you to identify Google's ID graph to better stitch users across devices and browsers. So what Google's trying to do is for businesses that don't have a lot of user IDs, their own signed in users, they're trying to provide a new way of using Google's identity graph to try and better kind of connect users across their various devices and browsers. Now, this is the default kind of setting that GA4 uses, is it uses blended by default. And it recommends that one of the first things you do when you set up GA4 is you enable Google Signals. And for me, this is something that's really important to understand, is what's actually happening when we're using Google Signals and what that means to the data in all the reports. So if I start going to reports, what we're going to start seeing is there is this checkbox at the top. And this checkbox is going to either be a triangle or a green kind of check. So this orange triangle or this kind of green check mark. When I am using Google Signals, which again is the default setting in GA4, we can see that many of the reports I'm looking at now have this thresholding applied. And what this means is that because we're using Google's proprietary data, Google's not going to let you figure out who is a Google user and who isn't. They basically are thresholding data to protect privacy. And what that means is basically in these reports, anything that has a really low amount of rows is going to be dropped from that report. And for me, this is one of the most confusing parts about GA4 and something I would really recommend that you take a close look at. So I'll give you an example. Let's say I change my date range to just a week and I go in this report, or I even change it to like just a day, and we look at the rows that are in this report. You can see in this particular report I'm looking at, I only have 11 rows. But if I change my date range, and the lowest row I have is the 63 rows. So if I change my date range to 2 days, I can now see I have an additional row with this click row. So depending on the amount of data that you're looking at, you might not actually be looking at a full report if you're using this Google Signal setting and this user identity graph by default. So this is a real problem for a lot of websites that have a small amount of traffic, or if you have something that just occurs very infrequently. So some of my customers, as an example, their conversions, like their form submit, might only happen, 10 to 20 times a month. And this thresholding setting might actually be preventing you from being able to see by default who's actually converting. You're actually losing that entire row. So because of that, one of the things I would recommend as kind of my first kind of key tip for GA4 is I highly recommend you try and avoid using this blended identity at all costs. I would recommend you change your identification in GA4 to device-based only. And what I'm really hoping Google does kind of maybe later this year or next year is I'm really hoping they allow us to actually not use Google Signals, because for me, it actually makes my analysis more difficult because I always have to be fearful that I'm not actually seeing the full picture and seeing all of my data. And for customers that have their own user IDs, it's actually even worse because the Google Signals can get in the way of you actually being able to use your own user IDs effectively. So for a few customers, I actually recommend not using Google Signals at all if your user IDs are really important. But if you don't need user IDs, or if you're okay just waiting until hopefully GA4 improves this, definitely recommend using your device-based only. And this is also hugely important because we're going to talk about this in a little bit. Data Studio, if you use the Data Studio connector for GA4, it'll also be pulling data based off of whatever setting is in here. So you could be producing some tables in Data Studio, and if you're using this blended kind of device graph and it has Google Signals, you would probably have no idea that your data is being thresholded. And worse, you don't have any visibility into what rows that you might not be able to report on because they're being dropped for privacy reasons. So that's kind of my first key tip is definitely in GA4, pay close attention to user identity. And I would really use that device ID only. Okay, moving on. Another kind of key component is Google Optimize. I love Google Optimize because, to my knowledge, it continues to be one of the only free tools that marketers have to do somewhat sophisticated A/B multivariate testing and even personalization that you can run from Optimize. And with GA4, there is a new integration directly for this. And if you've never seen Optimize before, it is super easy to use. It's super easy to set up. It's really powerful. And what's key for my tip here is that when you set up Optimize, it's required that you link it to GA4. So as an example, I ran a turtle or a pineapple test on my website. You can see the data that's available here. And the data is actually being pulled partially from Google Analytics through this integration. And as part of this integration with Google Optimize, what's also important to note is that the experiment data is also made available in Google Analytics. And that's really important because if you want to understand how a test is performing and what was a real winner, simply having a conversion usually isn't enough. You want to understand other aspects of that test. How did it perform for different sources or different channels or across different devices? So having data in Google Analytics lets you analyze your test in much more granularity to kind of have that confidence you're looking at. So in here, what I wanted to show is, let's say I change my date range and I just want to make sure I grab the date range that I ran that test. So when you link Google Optimize, it's going to create 2 events for you automatically. So you get an experiment impression. So if you're doing personalization in Optimize, so I have a personalization that's running where I'm renaming some of the content on my page. That creates this experiment impression event. And if you're running a test, then it's going to be the other event. And actually, I got those backwards. It's the optimized personalization impression. That's the personalization. And for any test, A/B test or multivariate tests, those are going to be this experiment impression. So this is what the tip and trick is that most people would probably expect if you set up a test and you run it, then you'll be able to do your analysis in Google Analytics automatically because everything is linked together. And unfortunately, that's not quite the case because by default, all that this integration does is it creates the event or the experiment. What's missing is that it doesn't create the parameters for that test automatically. So there's this fun thing in Google Analytics 4, where when you have events and you have parameters of an event, so here I have a personalization or an experiment event, and maybe I have experiment name or experiment ID. I want to know what experiment was testing. That's called a parameter of that original event. And one of the things you have to remember to do is you have to go inside GA4 and you have to actually create the custom dimensions for those parameters, or you won't be able to analyze your experiments or your personalization components from Optimize by default. So unfortunately, what usually happens is someone will run a test, wait 30 days for the experiment to end, come in Google Analytics and try and do analysis, and then find that these were never created. So that means they can't do their analysis in GA4. And unfortunately, you can't restore that data in the UI. These custom dimensions only work point in time forwards. So simply, if anyone in here is interested or already using Optimize, make sure that you remember to register the custom dimensions so that you can actually see which experiment was running. My hope is that Google will include these as default parameters, but I've been waiting, I think, over 12 months for those already. So hopefully next year, this will just be by default. But for now, just remember to register your experiment impressions and dimensions. So with that, I want to talk a little bit around attribution, and then we'll segue into reports. So attribution has always been one of the fundamental reasons that most marketers use something like Google Analytics. And Google Analytics has generally been one of the easiest places to do attribution and have easy to use reports and tools to even go much more advanced than the basic components. Now, what's interesting about GA4 is that the thing around attribution is that it's become much more flexible, but at the same time, I think it can become a lot more confusing, especially for new users. And what I'm seeing right now within our industry is there's a lot of people that are actually pulling the wrong sorts of data or reports and actually analyzing or digesting them incorrectly, because there is a misunderstanding or confusion around how scopes and how some of the attribution reports actually work. And to kind of unpack this, it's important to kind of start with there's 3 basically components of attribution in GA4. There's attribution at an event level, there's attribution at a session level, and then there's attribution at the user level. And previously, in the old version of Google Analytics, there was really only that session kind of scoped attribution. And that's why I think it was so simple. And GA4 has added this new kind of sophistication where we have kind of this first touch or user approach in addition to an actual individual event level component as well. And one of the things you might have heard about is that for the first time ever in Google Analytics, you can actually change the default attribution model within the platform. So previously, GA used a last non-direct attribution model by default in all the standard reports. And in GA4, there's actually a setting here. And in this setting, you can actually pick what attribution model you'd like to use. So instead of last click, you could use data-driven or linear or something else. And note that GA4 made a change, I think about a year ago, where it actually uses data-driven by default. So I'm going to change mine to data-driven. And this is another setting in GA4 where you can change this whenever you want. And this change will not permanently change any of your data. So all of the core data is unaffected and you can change it as many times as you want. So right now, I am using a data-driven attribution model as my reporting attribution. And I think most users would probably expect that basically everywhere we go now, we'll probably see that default attribution model. Just to make things a little simpler, I'm also going to change my user identity back to device-based because I don't like the thresholding. So now the question is, where can we access our data-driven attribution model in GA4? So first, I might go in acquisition and I might go to the user acquisition report. And we ask ourselves, is this a data-driven attribution model? And the answer is no, this is not a data-driven attribution model. This is the user acquisition report. And anywhere where you see this word user, it indicates that it's using really a first touch attribution model. So this is simply a report showing us the first touch. It's not using data-driven attribution. So if that's not data-driven attribution, then maybe I'll try this report, which is the session. So this is the next default traffic source report. And in here, now if we look at the dimension, it's called session default channel group. And we ask ourselves, is this a data-driven attribution model? And the answer is, this is also not a data-driven attribution model. I would know if it was DDA or data-driven attribution if I started seeing fractions or decimals where things were being divided. And here I'm only seeing whole numbers. And the reason this is not data-driven attribution is because this is still kind of that last non-direct attribution model at a session level. So this is similar to what Universal Analytics was doing, but this is what we call the session scoped attribution. So then where is our data-driven attribution? Well, it's really only in two places. It's in one particular area called advertising. And in the advertising section, there is attribution reports. But in here, this is where you actually come in and you can see immediately, I have fractions. So this is using the data-driven attribution report. So if you go inside your advertising section, this is using the event scoped. The other place the DDA model is in engagement, there is a conversions report. And let's ask ourselves a question again. Is this a data-driven attribution report? And here we can see we have decimals, but they're all zeros. This is almost DDA, but not quite. This will only be a data-driven attribution report if you click on an individual conversion. So let's say, as an example, I want to know all of these blog views. Where did the traffic come from? Now, if I scroll down, now that I've clicked into the report, I can see the conversions, I can see my decimals, and now I'm looking at a data-driven attribution. So this is where I think a good way to illustrate and hopefully help you understand this is if we go to explorations. This explore area is one of the most important parts of GA4. This is where I probably spend 90% of my time in the platform. In here, if we were to create a report from scratch and we were to do something like search for medium, there's these different options I'm talking about. There's the attribution. This is the event scoped. And then there's the traffic source, which is the user and the session scoped. So the first touch and the session. So if you're trying to use the flexible attribution in GA4, just make sure you're always looking for the event scoped. options. And those will always just be called medium or campaign or source. And if you're using first user or you see first user anywhere, just know that's first touch. And if you see session in front of anything, know that that's kind of the last non-direct component. And this is important because let's say you have a session and the session has 3 events. And event 1 is someone came from a paid ad and they went to your homepage. And then immediately after, they searched on Google for something else and then clicked on an organic result and came back. And then maybe they went to their email and they clicked on an email and then visited your site, all within 30 minutes. In a session scoped, only the first traffic source, that paid ad, gets credit. You would miss the other 2. In the first user, if that's the first interaction the user ever had, then the paid ad gets all the credit. The only way you could see all 3 sources is if you use the medium dimension for your attribution. So in short, attribution, I hopefully have illustrated, can be much more confusing in GA4, especially if you're using it for the first time. So my recommendation is just start trying to build some comfort and some knowledge around the 3 different scopes, and make sure that if data is being shared or reported on across your organization, that there is a lot of scrutiny being applied to make sure the right dimensions are being mixed with the right metrics and the right scopes to produce what you expect. So at first, that flexible setting of changing the attribution model everywhere in GA4 sounded pretty exciting. But when you kind of dive in and see what it's doing, just know it's actually a lot more limited than you might think, where it's only applying to a certain specific set of reports and dimensions, not necessarily everywhere. So with that, I think 2 other kind of quick things I'll end with since we're kind of approaching time. Another really important part that we've kind of built on is that there's 2 kind of distinct areas of Google Analytics 4. There's these standard reports that we've kind of been navigating around. And then in addition, there is this explore area where I talked about that I personally spend all of my time kind of creating my reports kind of from scratch. And something that I think a lot of people don't realize is that different parts of GA4 kind of pull from different data sources. So as an example, if I go into these reports over here and I go into the engagement and maybe I go to events, we can see we have our standard kind of dimensions and metrics. And if I customize this report, I could actually apply like a conversion instance to this. Whereas if I go to the Explore reports and I start building these reports from scratch, in many cases, there's kind of different sets of dimensions and metrics. So if I sort for rate as an example, sorry, I should be in my metric. So let's say I search for conversion. You can see I have session conversion rate and user conversion rate, but I don't have individual conversion rates. So I can't report on if I have a form or a download or something individually unique. I can't easily create a report in this area for that individual conversion. So there's a lot of differences in what data is available in each place in GA4. And even more so, Data Studio uses the data from the standard reports, not from the explorations. So this is a whole other topic we could probably spend 30 minutes on, where it's also really important to start building kind of comfort around where is the best place to kind of report or pull data from each individual source. And I think, unfortunately, right now, the standard reports and Data Studio are extremely limited with a lot of the kind of limitations around the API tokens that just happened, some of the schema, some cardinality and other components. So for most of you, I would encourage you to try and spend as much time in explorations as possible for reports. And this is another area where I'm hoping Google spends lots of time on adding lots of additional kind of core capabilities and components. With that, I think I'm going to pause here. I think the most important parts I wanted to really kind of take you through today is just as you're getting deeper into GA4, there's a whole new kind of layer of learnings that you really need to start picking up and applying. And it's really important to kind of ask questions around the data you're looking at. And if you see something that doesn't look right, things like what I'm showing today, there's lots of other things like this that you will kind of pick up over time. So definitely pay attention to your user identity. Make sure you're paying special attention to the attribution and how that's being pulled, and really start kind of scrutinizing and building familiarity of kind of what parts in GA4 you're pulling data from where and why.